sit on the side, feel free to move your chairs in front so that you can see if you are not in a place where you can see right now, all right? I'm sure that there will be room in the back or something for us to put some chairs as well. We want to be able to see the presentation.
Good morning. Thank you so much for those kind words. I'm very glad to see everybody here today, and it's such an honor for me to be here at this city. Oh, sorry. How about this? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? I think it should be higher. That would be good. Hello? Good morning. Good morning. I can't actually see the presentation, so I might not be facing you during the entire presentation, but it doesn't mean that I am not so very happy to have everybody here today, hearing this story about Ohio and your connection to it. And it's very good to be in Oklahoma again among my friends and my family. The title of my talk refers to stewardship, which means to care for and to protect and to honor. And in this case, the ancestral lands of the Shawnee. The Shawnee people are people of the eastern woodlands. And when you travel to one of the historic Shawnee places, and when you walk on the ground where the Shawnee have lived for centuries, you are walking on your ancestors' lands. And when you go to the ancient sites in the Ohio Valley, such as the Great Circle and the Octagon Earthworks, the Flint Quarry at Flint Ridge or Serpent Mound, you are returning to places that were imagined, designed, built, and used by the people who have been called the ancestors of our ancestors. The people who were here 2,000, 3,000, and 5,000 years ago. And your relatives who lived in the eastern woodlands surely knew about the earthworks and the mounds that are all over Ohio. Because mounds, earthworks, and geometric shapes, effigy mounds in the shape of animals and symbols dot the landscape, especially before 1492. Throughout the eastern half of North America, people had been building mounds for at least 5,000 years. If a group didn't build the earthworks and mounds, they knew of a group who did, and they lived among the mounds and earthen monuments. The people from long ago, your ancient woodland ancestors, developed river transportation, canoes large and small, boats of reeds and river bamboo, and expertly traveled the waterways throughout the coastal areas and the rivers. They were probably trading and visiting diverse groups all the way from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, to the Atlantic coast, and to the far west. In historic times, in the 1700s and 1800s, your relatives were among the last tribal groups to leave Ohio before settlement and the violence and the removals began. Your relatives understood the earthworks were designed by human minds, built by human hands, and by people who had lived long ago. Your relatives took care of the earthworks and mounds around them. They did not build on top of them. We think they respected them. When you visit these places in Ohio, consider yourselves welcome. Your relatives were here in Ohio, there in Ohio, and you are returning to your ancestral lands. 2,000 years ago, creative, ambitious people created brilliant, fantastical, geometric earthen architecture in this area that, as far as we know, are unique to the Americas, a cultural revolution. In what is now Ohio, they began planning and building monuments made of Midwest earth, using their knowledge of what we would call today astronomy and geology and earth engineering and mathematics. They situated enormous earthen architecture that was located in places that did not flood or degrade over thousands of years, and produced mounds and earthworks that are still standing and were still here in large numbers in the late 1700s. All throughout the woodlands, the eastern half of the United States today. This is Ohio, and each of the dots on this map represents a mound or earthen shape or a cluster of earthworks. Most have been destroyed since the mid-1800s by farming, the development of towns, and all that goes with that: canals, railroads, houses, and so on. Some of these dots represent mounds, which are volcano-shaped earthen mounds that were graves and contain burials, some very large, up to 8 feet tall. But large earthen enclosures that still stand are rare. There are two places where the earthworks have been preserved and rebuilt, and we'll talk about those. One was in Newark and one was in Chillicothe. Once the settlers arrived, the earthworks were either looted or destroyed in construction and farming. Settlers were intensely interested in digging these mounds because when the builders of the mounds and earthworks passed on, their relatives buried them with massive amounts of jewelry, tools of stone carving. These items were made out of materials from other places across America, and through them we can track the travel and the trade that took place. They likely got these things through a very active exchange. There were huge conch seashells from the Gulf Coast, silver from Canada, shark's teeth from the Atlantic Ocean, mica from the Carolinas, pipestone and obsidian from the Western Plains and the Rocky Mountains. Trade, travel, cultural exchange. These are the hallmarks of an active, dynamic, intelligent American continent. In Newark, there's a complex of earthworks called the Newark Earthworks. This is a survey map from around 1830. In 1830, this set of geometric earthworks was complete and intact. It was planned, designed, and built over a 4 square mile area. It contains 4 enormous geometric shapes. Each shape is an enormous earthwork of its own. Each reflects precision construction, perfect or nearly perfect circles, straight lines, and very consistent level tops. The entire set of earthworks was encircled by a low earthen wall, a walkway that had walls 3 to 4 feet tall. And there was a very prescribed and specified way in which to walk around the set of earthworks. Just take a look at the walkways that connect these huge earthworks. You can go from the circle to the square to the oval part there at the right side. You can walk from the circle to the square to the octagon part. Octagon connected by 2 parallel lines to a circle, the octagon. There was water nearby, and there was a central feature border, but it wasn't a barrier because you could not walk between the circle and the octagon. Right? The standard unit of measure was used to build these things so very precisely, 1,054 feet. It is repeated over and over and over in Ohio. And multiples of this measure are used to map out the distances between earthworks. In this complex, 6 times 1,054 is the distance between the 2 circles on the map, and also between sites, slightly. It was also used to make small circles and squares. And geometry was used to build these earthen shapes. The purpose of these shapes, we know a little bit about. The circle down on the right-hand side was clearly a ceremonial site. The deceased were prepared for burial there. And the square was a ceremonial site, most likely, a place in between for preparation for the journey and interment. The oval sort of shape there in the top right-hand corner was the cemetery for the entire complex. There were no burials other places here. And the octagon connected to a circle was a lunar observatory. It marks only the lunar alignments that make up the 18.6-year lunar cycle that culminates in the lunar standstill, which is celebrated over the entire globe by different civilizations and people. The city of Newark decided to take hold where they found these earthworks, and they set about building on top of them right away. In 60 years, the set of earthworks was no longer recognizable. In 1848, on the right top map, you see that it's mostly complete, but there's a line that runs through it. That's a canal. On the left map, you see a couple of lines and some things in there, houses, buildings, farming started. And by 1902, you can barely make it out at all, as Newark had built completely over it. The octagon earthworks still stand, and the great circle still stands. The octagon and the circle were extremely unique, and that's why they were not destroyed. This is the great circle. The great circle is a great scale, so I gave you some slides to get an idea of that. There's a road that circles it at the top, and those are houses up there. The entryway opens to the east, and you can see that there's a ditch. That's that wide round part that's inside of the circle. That was filled with slate and clay, and it held water. Water was very important. Here's a digital recreation to give you a sense of what it might have looked like before the city encroached on it. And then here's about 50 people standing at that entryway to the east. And here's another picture of people walking into it from the high wall. So walking into the great circle, and you can see the ditch on the left side of the screen. The octagon was also preserved because they did not know that it was an astronomical observatory. Nobody knew that at all. They just thought it was really unique. So it was preserved. An aerial shows that it's hard to see. It's so subtle. These earthworks are subtle. They live into the landscape, and they're built to the scale of the environment and the nature around them. This is a earthwork that's been built up to the very edge. But notice you can see a circle and parallel lines and an octagon. And I've given you a sense of scale by giving you the dimensions, 50 acres within the octagon walls, 20 acres within the circle walls, nearly perfect circle. And then there at the end, you can see two tails at the end of the circle. There's an end to a circle. And that was a place people could stand. It was an observatory mound. And the little circle on the south side there in the middle is a part of it. It's part of the alignments. And Stonehenge could fit inside with lots of room for people to walk around. The octagon also had open corners. And in each corner, there was a barrier mound, not burial, but a barrier mound, keeping it a special, mysterious place. From the outside, you can't see in what's going on, and from the inside, you can't see out. You can only go in through the octagon because the circle is closed. Transformation, magic, we don't know. There again it is on the aerial. The walls are very straight, very long, very level, very large. Two scholars confirmed only in the 1980s that it was an astronomical observatory to mark this 8-point lunar alignment. And there's an arrow that bisects the figure. At the arrow point is where the moon rises, and you would sight down between the parallel lines from the edge of the circle. They were actually trying to prove that any ancient site had alignments just by accident, that the ancient people did not know how to track astronomical bodies and to mark them on the ground, to keep track of them. And when they went to find solstice, because that's what Stonehenge had, they found nothing. And they thought that was weird. And a graduate student piped up and said, well, try lunar. And to their astonishment, it hit all 8. So you have the rectangular highlighted the edge of the circle all the way up to the arrow. Well, here's what it looks like at the top of the octagon. when you look in. You can see there's a barrier. You can't see the walls all the way down. You can see the barrier mounds. And you can also see there's a road right there. They built up to the very edge. Then if we look down at the circle, this is Observatory Mound, and about 75 to 100 people could be standing on that, watching as the moonrises come up. This means they knew when the moonrises were coming up, they could schedule events, and probably it wasn't all about the moonrises, it was probably about what activities were cued by the moonrises in that season of moonrises. During a lunar standstill, 3 years happened where the moon rises to that northern part. The moon rises are beautiful. I've been honored to see about 5 of them. Another very interesting place in Ohio is Marietta. Marietta was built at the confluence of the Ohio River and the mouth of the Muskingum River. Note that the rivers make up the border of the state of Ohio. So if you traveled north, you would get to Pittsburgh with the Three Rivers Stadium. You probably know about that. Well, Three Rivers confluence, which means that would have been a big gathering place as well. And sure enough, there are earthworks there, but they're way destroyed. If you go south, you'll end up in Portsmouth, Cincinnati, and head down southeast, where there's a whole civilization of earthworks. Very different from these, but earthworks nonetheless. This is what Marietta looked like. It was a very large earthworks complex, and it had a walkway that was built right up to the river. So they found this really splendid place to make a home 2,000 years ago, where people would gather together regularly for trade and cultural exchange. But I think Marietta might also link the ancient history to the historic era when your relatives were there, and even into the present day. Because Marietta was a land that was fought over. The settlers tried to establish city, attacked Marietta for a long time. And every time they did, the Indians routed them out, and they couldn't stay. And they tried this again and again and again until they finally made Marietta an armed camp, an armed settlement. And they finally, in 1788, made Marietta the first settlement in Ohio. And after that, a lot of things started happening. Tribes began leaving Ohio. There was a heightened violence and removal. The Treaty of Greenville was signed, which further eroded the American Indian presence in Ohio. The state of Ohio was established in 1823, and the last tribe leave in 1843. By 1850, there are no more tribes in Ohio. What happened after settlement began? Well, we call it a history of removal, of course, but it was also a history of erasure. Erasing from the land any evidence of people who lived there, their towns, their villages, all evidence of Indian life, and the earthworks as well. In 1846, when most of these sites were still there, the Smithsonian got involved. They wanted to document all these earthworks and what was coming out of them, excavate them down to the ground. This was a period of frantic excavation by both personal, private individuals and organizations. Huge collections of materials came out of the earthworks, as well as the digging of and unburial of people who had been interred. And they often term this as heroic archaeology. Again, I just showed you this one. Only 2 of the earthworks remained in Newark. You would think they would preserve it, protect it, and find it precious. But instead, on top of the octagon, they built a country club. A private country club. Which means that a private country club has lots of stuff they put on the ground. Golf course, greens, watering systems, swimming pools, sidewalks. There was a lease that was in place that they were renewing every, 10, 15, 20 years, something like that. But in 1992, there was a dig at the Great Circle, and the American Indian community there in Ohio launched a protest and tried to stop the digging. And this chilled the people to the bones, the country club owners and the Ohio Historical Society. because they to define these places as sacred sites and actively put time towards stopping it. They needed to do something right away. Was it have conversations with people? It was to extend their lease without public comment in a private meeting. So the country club is leased till 2078. The people who built the earthworks and used them to inter their relatives who passed on and to build them for ceremony made really beautiful things. They made things to use in ceremony, things to use every day. They buried their relatives with them. And these were found as they excavated mounds, but also just when people were farming, because they would farm over these areas. I wanted to know what guidelines there were, because these seemed to belong not just to one organization, an individual, or a group. These things are really beautiful. That's a mica hand, the stone pipe, the hawk. This is the Ray figurine. It was found in the cemetery of the Newark earthwork. It is highly valued as one of the artifacts that belongs in a collection at the Ohio Historical Society. And it's because it shows a person from 2,000 years ago and their regalia. It's a bear regalia, pulling the regalia over his head, and in his lap, or her lap, is a mask with a severed head that looks very Mayan and characteristic. What an enigmatic history. It is a funerary object because it came to be raised. So I didn't really have much context to answer questions about it or even to formulate my own opinion until I was invited to present at the Bridge Gap Conference. And when I did, they had a tour trip to Chickasaw Cultural Center. And there I learned that the Chickasaws have a policy they put in their museum. And it says, we do not put burial objects on display. And I have been at the Ohio Historical Society and other places where artifacts were constantly on display. And it never mentioned they were funerary objects. So they say they work with archaeologists and institutions to reinter them because they believe that it's important to recreate these items that belong to their relatives. There's great resistance to doing this because there's a huge lucrative market in exchanging these items that are found in collections and that have been dug up. Most of the digging is illegal now, or at least frowned upon. It's on public land. You can see that in one quarter, the old barn in Findlay, Ohio, netted about $300,000 in sales of just these types of items from the Midwest, ancient civilization. And in another time, it was about $250,000. It has been much higher recently because the prices have increased. And individuals can earn, if you can call it that, up to $20,000 to $30,000 for a single piece. So it's very hard to overcome profit goals here and to allow people a chance to have a conversation about it. The conversations are shut down. So in Ohio, there's a lot of confusion about a lot of things related to American Indians, and that's partly because there aren't any federally recognized tribes there. Tribes that can exert their kind of sovereignty and cultural authority over issues related to their ancestral land. The Ohio policymakers and legislators, they demonstrate confusion about specific things, definitions of what tribal sovereignty are, the history and relevance of treaties, the federal recognition process for tribes, and the applicability of federal law on Indian rights and lands. In addition, there are groups in Ohio who claim tribal status without a relationship with a federally recognized tribe. Groups and individuals without connections to tribes claim to represent Indians in Ohio who try to profit by incorporating Indian culture. An attempt to influence legislation about American Indian issues in Ohio and have been successful at doing this. The American Indians in Ohio want this abuse to stop. Why is this an issue? We found a document. It was a letter from the SHPO officer of Ohio in 1999 in response to a kind of onslaught of letters people asking to be recognized as state level, as tribes, for their organizations. And they mulled it over and sent this letter back to them. The letter says, don't worry about federal recognition. Incorporate. Then you can own your property, promote your culture. And it keeps us out of the business of having to decide which group should be recognized as a tribe in the state of Ohio. The misrepresentation of tribal sovereignty, the misunderstanding of the federal recognition process is breathtaking. We're gagging. The result can look like this. This is a book that is in the Columbus Library, and my son brought it home when he was younger to write a report. It gives very misleading information about the Shawnee today, and it mentions one of the groups who have been very active in Ohio trying to make legislation and trying to speak for all Indians in Ohio. I want to repeat. The American Indians, a federally recognized tribes and who are descendants directly, want this situation to be changed, want to find effective solutions to stop it. So we do. I think we look toward tribal stewardship and stewardship on the part of individuals. We can protect the Indian rights and land and history in Ohio if we work together. And what does tribal stewardship look like? It looks like us. We educate the policymakers and the public. We build alliances. And we promote legislative reforms. And we don't do this on a person-to-person level. Who is here? Who is here? Who is there in Ohio? Well, we have to educate our partners about the different levels of American Indian and tribal authority that exist throughout the country. So I made this little chart. It may not be absolutely correct, but I think it makes the point that at the federal level, with the President, the Congress, the federally recognized tribes, and the National Park Service who make policy based that are federal in scope. At the national level, with the National Congress of American Indians and the National Museum of American Indians, I know that's a federal entity, but the policy debates are not federal level. And at the state level, there's the SHPO office, the Historical Society, and the governor. And they don't get to make federal policy. And then there's the local regional level, which is Indian centers and American Indians for individuals who do not get paid for all this. And this is something that we've been sharing with our partners, and they've been sharing with their constituents, and they sometimes don't believe it. But we have to keep working at it and educating with them about it. We have resources in Ohio. Let me show you some of them. There are people in Ohio who have come there for work, they were born there, their family there. They are members of federally recognized tribes or they are direct descendants. All of the people listed, pictured here, have worked very hard on projects to preserve Indian land and Indian rights in Ohio. Another thing we can do is we can reclaim these places that are defined in archaeological terms in a sterile way, as the people did not really get involved with them, by holding events that include American Indian people and their public, so the community gets involved. This is Walk with the Ancients public program in 2009. The Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma has established historical markers to mark the land as important to the Shawnee, that they have interest here, that it's important to them in their history, to honor the Shawnee people who were there. We can have cultural exchanges where Shawnee people go to these sites and engage in public activities with the public, and then show and personally make connections with people in Ohio so they understand that it's not just the reenactors they see a lot, that American Indian people are, as Ryan Floyd said, a lot like them. The Chickasaw Nation was informative on a lot of these points for me. They have a whole exhibit that talks about their mound building pasts in Mississippi up to Tennessee, and they have a lot of heritage tours as well. And they really feel that it's important to gain strength and understanding about the history of the Chickasaw. And individually, the Chickasaw people benefit by feeling a connection with not only where they were, but the ancients who came before them, and they believe were directly descended. Learning about places where the Shawnee actually were, we know were there for sure. Anytime you walk in Ohio, you know Shawnee walked there before you. But here at Flint Ridge Quarry, this is where people got quarried throughout the entire area. And the Shawnee were there getting quarried. And the group that came, I say June 2014 and of course June 2013, were able to sit and learn about how Flint was managed and procured and the importance of it. It was very important to living in the woodlands. Working toward legislative reform is really important. So far, Chief Leonard Wallace has testified before the Legislative Committee about protections for graves over 125 years old. Because they're not protected, they belong to the landowner who can do whatever they want to with them. It's not on it's on private land, and that's Ohio law. The World Heritage Initiative is extremely important because it brings together so many people, and it is a global initiative. World Heritage sites include Chaco Canyon and Cahokia, and Teotihuacan and Stonehenge. And by 2020, the American Indian Hopewell ceremonial earthworks will be inscribed at World Heritage sites. We're working on it. We have a lot of people working on it with us. And this, I want to just say that if there's an opportunity to create businesses, to create ideas for how to address what is coming once World Heritage is inscribed, I think the Shawnee people should be involved in it because they expect that the visitorship to these sites will increase many, many times over. Cahokia went from like 20,000 people a year to 200,000 people a year. And all those people need things. They need things about the earthworks. They need infrastructure around the site. They need items to sell in the gift shop. They need interpreters and speakers. There's a lot of opportunity coming our way. It's going to raise the water level and blow everybody's boat. Some of the people that are involved with the World Heritage Initiative include Chief Luna, National Park Ranger of Great Note, Gerard Baker, who was the first superintendent of the National Park, and Jennifer Peterson-Weinberger, who was Athabascan. Sonia Adelaide, who is on the National Committee for NAGPRA, and she's also a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and she's learning this year her nationality, culture, and language. And Chad Allen and Alice Rupunga, they both have connections to New Zealand. Chad is a descendant of Chickasaw, but they have been very instrumental in bringing groups and groups of scholars, hundreds of scholars to the sites to learn more about these places and to help us preserve them. In 2011, we wanted to take it national, so we sponsored, the Eastern Shawnee Tribe co-sponsored a resolution with the Newark Earthworks Center, and we got passed through this process. Some of you might have been involved in the resolution process with NCAI. You go through a lot of committees and rewrites, and we got a resolution successfully passed endorsing recognition for World Heritage for these sites. Art. Art is a very powerful way to explore and interpret the meaning of having an ancestral homeland in the Ohio Valley and being removed and now living in Oklahoma. Examples of this are all around us in this Indigo Sky casino. Art on the walls, Ruth Blaylock Jones and Doug Hall, who explored the idea of place, the theme of trees and woodlands in the interior design. This is Don Secondines' interpretation of the removal from Ohio. And Alex Davis' exploration of life in the log mill. We need American Indians to speculate about what happened to these earthworks and see if it coincides with the research that we know. Earthworks are level and long, and there are places between them. You can run for miles. There are center poles that were in the center of these earthworks. Well, that sounds familiar, right? Leanne now came and asked, These places have been used for stickball? She says, yes. It would be a connection from the ancients to today. Another resource is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. This is in the early stages. We're not sure what the lawyers are going to make of this. But one thing this declaration says is that people who have been removed from their ancestral homelands have a right to maintain, protect, and preserve the cultural manifestations of their tribe in their removed homelands. What would that mean for Shawnee? The Shawnee tribes have already made a difference in present-day Ohio through the actions they've taken to establish their presence and through the willingness to have ongoing dialogue on issues related to historic preservation and cultural exchanges, educated state leaders, and the public. Kevin Gober, who is the director of the National Museum of the American Indian, often says that tribes' knowledge and perspective can provide alternative strategies to address the issues and problems facing our entire country now. The country needs tribal wisdom. This is especially applicable in your ancestral land, Ohio, and in the areas of the economy, environment, and education, and preservation. Don Fitzigo was the first American Indian scholar to visit the earthworks on invitation in 2004. He toured the earthworks, we had a lunch, and he had seen the earthworks for all of 5 minutes. But the group of historians and scholars in the room asked him what he thought about the earthworks. And they all leaned forward as he paused and thought. And he ended up giving us a call to action. He said, all of us who are Indian are descendants of the mound builders, and their blood runs in our veins. Thank you very much.
The 1817 Treaty and the 1818 Treaty, in which we reserved for ourselves Lewistown. So there's no question that the signers of that part of the treaty and about Lewistown were our Eastern Shawnee ancestors. And so I'm not going to go over the terms, I'm pretty sure I am running out of time, but look at, we were promised an annuity of $1,000 every year, forever. Are we still getting our $1,000 annuity? Do you know what, folks? The Onondaga Nation in upstate New York, their treaty says they get $4,000 of trade goods, and they still receive to this day $4,000 worth of cloth trade goods every year. So for them, that's very crucial. $4,000 in cotton goods, that doesn't mean anything, but forcing the United States to comply with that treaty promise 200 years later, that's what's important to the Onondagas. But you have to read 1818 treaty in conjunction with the 1817 because Congress mandated a change to the 1817 treaty, and so the 1818 treaty is a supplement. So I like comparing the both. Did the same chief sign? What's going on? I still don't know if Black Book was really one of our, the ancestors of the Eastern Shawnee tribe, but he was the signer. Then read the 1831 and 1832 treaties that I provided here, because those are our removal treaties in which we agreed to leave Ohio and move here. And then, we did sign a treaty with the Confederate States. That got us in a lot of trouble. If you know your history here, you know there was violence and the South was pretty much in control, so we were probably forced to enter that agreement with the Confederacy. But the United States used that against us later. But then ultimately just focus on the last page, the Treaty of 1867. Because that is when we split from the Senecas, divided our reservation, and we took the name the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Indians. So we have so much history right here that I really just started pouring into. These are the treaties that I think are related to our present-day government. There are lots of other Shawnee treaties, but most of them then are from the Cape Girardeau Shawnees, and Kansas. So I don't see those as our ancestors of the Eastern Shawnee tribe. So these are the treaties that I'm going to write about, that I'm studying. I hope some of you can give us information. I'm related to that one treaty signer of the South. So that's what we're looking for, is more and more information and more knowledge from our own community. So our treaties are crucial. This is what I'll be writing about for the next couple of years. And we want to learn more about them and see what our rights are today and understand what treaty making means in Indian country. We are a government. This is why I like the word citizen. I'm going to say it, I don't like saying that I'm a member of something. We're not the member of the Elks Club. We're not a member of the PTA. We are a citizen of a government, the third form of government recognized in the Constitution. Do I need to take you back to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution? The tribes are governments on a par with foreign nations, with the several states, and we sign treaties with the United States. And to this very day, we continue to engage in a government-to-government political relationship. Thank you for your interest. Thank you very much. Some of my classes, so I convince you to go to law school somehow. I want to thank Chief Wallace and everyone that's involved with bringing me here and being a part of this project. I spent 25 years studying and teaching Indian law, and so I am absolutely over the moon, delighted to be able to work on my own tribe and things that I'm learning already. So I'm going to share with you today some issues about our treaties. And I have created a chart. I probably may not even talk about the chart yesterday, but I hope you do get a copy of it. Study it carefully. I listed our tribals and perhaps our ancestors that signed some of these treaties so that perhaps we can trace some of these names and the chiefs of our band, the mixed band of Seneca and Shawnee. I'm going to talk sort of in general about treaty issues today. And what is a treaty? Why did the tribes sign them? Why did European nations and the United States enter treaty relationships with Indian tribes? So it is a fact, ladies and gentlemen, that the European nations that came to this continent dealt with Indian tribes as governments on what today we call a government-to-government relationship. The European countries that came here, England, France, Spain, Russia, Holland, all engaged in treaty-making diplomatic relations with tribal governments. The United States, once the United States was created, inherited this idea that you deal with tribes as governments, as sovereigns in control of territory and people, and that you deal in a diplomatic, political relationship with tribes. The United States ultimately, folks, enacted 375 treaties with tribes, primarily in the lower 48 states. And I must say that the Shawnee tribe probably signed more treaties in the United States than anything. So we'll talk about that issue in just a moment. But the United States even enshrined the idea of treaty making into the Constitution. And we'll also look at some information on that in a moment. And then our first president, George Washington, began the process and developed the procedures of how to deal with the Senate in ratifying treaties with tribes and how the executive branch would negotiate the treaties out in the field. And George Washington literally enshrined the process of dealing with tribes and made it equal to how the United States signed treaties with foreign countries. And I want to drive that point home with you too. Under the Constitution, and we'll look at that provision, and then under these procedures that George Washington started in his very first term in office, was to treat Indian treaties on a par with the international treaties the United States signed with foreign countries. So we want to remember that. But there were also countervailing negative provisions that governed American Indian. And it even started with good old George Washington. And so I cannot resist telling you his policy towards Indian tribes that I think was federal Indian policy for over 190 years. And he described it in a letter that he wrote to Congress in September of 1783. He was only a general then. We just finished the Revolutionary War, and the Congress asked him, how should we deal with the tribes? Many tribes had fought for the British in the Revolution, and so the Congress wanted to be real negative and real harsh on the tribal entities that had fought for the English. But George Washington wrote them a letter of advice, September the 7th, 1783, that you can read today online. He wrote a letter to one of the senators, James Wayne. And it's a 3 or 4 page letter, and he advises the Congress, let's not fight these tribes. We don't have to spend tax dollars on a standing army. We don't have to shed blood. We don't have to fight the tribes, because guess what? He then used an analogy. He says, the savage as the wolf. And he asked the Congress, he said, what happens to the animals of the forest as we expand our borders? He said, why, the animals retreat. And now I can almost quote the letter. He says, it is the same with the savage as the wolf. So he was analogizing Indian peoples, I guess, to animals, and maybe not to be too mean on George. Let's say he was just using this as an analogy. And what he was telling the Congress, we don't have to fight the tribes. They will retreat from us. They will naturally disappear as the United States expands and gets stronger. And there'll be no Indians. And we will get their lands as soon as we want them and just whenever we feel like it. Now, does that remind you of something? Does that remind you of what we call American Manifest Destiny? What was Manifest Destiny? When was that phrase first used? 1845. It was first used about Texas. 6 months later, it was used about where I'm from, the Oregon country. The idea that God intended the United States to own those areas. And so what is Manifest Destiny? The idea that the United States is destined by divine direction to sweep across the continent. Who's in the way of that? Us. And so what was George Washington telling the Congress? We'll get the land whenever we want it. We don't need to fight Indians. That, folks, was federal Indian policy probably until the 1960s and into the 1970s. And so what's the answer? Well, George, you're gone, but we're still here. Thank you very much. Well, the other policy that I do want to mention, and of course I have to mention, is I've written 2 books on this. And I'm sorry I'm going to do a commercial here. I was in the used car business for 19 years, so I got some books on this. Come on over and kick a book or 2. Johnson v. McIntosh. What did Europeans think about indigenous peoples? What does international law provide for the rights of indigenous peoples around the world? Well, that's exactly what this case, United States Supreme Court case, not until 1923, of course, but it was about land purchases made from tribes in what's today Illinois and Indiana in 1773 and 1775. It took 50 years for these land purchases, and whether they were legal, to make it to the United States Supreme Court. So I'm not going to spend any more time talking on this, but we need to understand what European countries and then the United States, under their law, how did they see tribal ownership of lands? And so Johnson v. McIntosh stands for 3 main principles, and it is still the law today, folks. This is not just an interesting old funny case about how Chief Justice John Marshall thought about Indians and tribes in 1823. This is the founding principle of federal Indian law today, and is still applicable. The United States Supreme Court cited this case in a 2005 case. This country was settled on discovery and conquest. Europeans claimed the land, claimed sovereignty and rights over us and over our land merely by arriving and sticking their flag and their cross in the soil. You've seen those paintings. They were making legal claims to the lands that they were discovering. Of course, the native people were here. Hey, we're here. But the Europeans pretended like they discovered it. But what does the court say happened the moment Europeans came ashore? Tribes lost some of their property rights, lost some of the ownership rights of their land, and tribes lost some of their sovereign powers. No longer were tribes to deal internationally. They were only supposed to deal with the European country that had allegedly discovered it. These 2 principles are still federal Indian law today, folks. This tribe, my tribe, all other federally recognized tribes, if you own trust lands, the United States is the legal owner of your property. You are the beneficial owner of your property. Citation to authority, Johnson v. McIntosh. Where did Johnson v. McIntosh come from? Papal bulls from the 1450s about the indigenous peoples of Africa. So the international law, we call this today the doctrine of discovery. Since this case, it's been called the doctrine of discovery. This is still international law today in the United States and really almost anywhere in the world that there were indigenous peoples. So don't forget that while George Washington had good things to say about tribes and dealing with tribes on a government-to-government basis and treaty basis, there were also other nefarious ideas about the future of tribes and then the property rights of tribes. So very quickly, what's an example? The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was issued by King George III, and he was trying to control his own colonists and stopping them from crossing the Appalachian and Allegheny Mountains and going literally into our country, the Ohio country. So in 1763, he issues this royal order, and this is still the law in Canada today, folks. The Royal Proclamation still controls Canadian native law. Here, of course, we don't pay any attention to it anymore. But the king tried to control and define Indian country, and he also, if you read this, I didn't give you the full quote, he was defining his doctrine of discovery rights for native lands in the Ohio Valley. And he claimed that his colonists could not cross the crest of those mountains nor purchase lands from tribes and Indians without royal permission. And I can quote you the language in the order. He says, "Those lands are reserved unto me, although I have not yet purchased it." He was alleging his international law doctrine. I'm glad you laughed, because that's kind of funny, isn't it? I should come to, hey, I'm coming to the state. I'm coming to your house today with the Bob Miller flag and the Bob Miller cross, and I'm a claiming you. Okay. But this idea of the doctrine of discovery, folks, was always in the mind of Europeans and then later the United States. England and its colonies here in the East Coast signed over 100 treaties with tribes from 1620 forward. Spain signed more than 30 treaties with tribes across Florida, southeast, and then even into California and West New Mexico, Arizona today. So all these European countries dealt with tribes in treaty making. Our colonies, our states signed treaties with American Indian tribes too, and the United States signed treaties in these specific time areas, and signed 375 treaties ultimately with tribes. Our tribe from the Northwest, the old Northwest we called it, look what Congress promised us in 1787. I think I have a laser. Oh, look at that. Our property rights would never be taken unless in just and lawful wars. We call the wars just and we call them lawful. But our property rights were to be protected. So even though the doctrine of discovery was the law, and Europeans assumed they had acquired some form of property ownership over our land just by showing up, there was still recognized ownership of land by tribal governments. So all these European countries and in the United States has always purchased land from tribal governments through the treaty-making process. That has always been colonial colonization principle, and it's still law today. What are our treaties? When we write this book and you get your copies of it, you'll see, I'm pretty sure we're going to do some maps, you'll see how our movements, a lot of our movements, certainly after the United States was formed, was as we signed treaties, often under some kind of coercion, and we moved, our land base was diminished. That's the story with every tribe that signed treaties in the United States. Exactly what George Washington said in 1789. So where are tribes mentioned in the Constitution? How is Indian law and the status of Indian tribes as governments enshrined in the U.S. Constitution? Well, this is called the Commerce Clause, and most people call it the Interstate Commerce Clause. We call this the Indian Commerce Clause. Who had the authority in the new United States to deal with tribal governments? State by state, or only the feds? And this provision says only the feds had the authority to deal with tribes. The Congress has the power to regulate trade with the foreign nations, among the states, and with the Indians. This is the only reference to tribes in the United States Constitution, but this is an enormously important provision. The United States Supreme Court and federal courts have cited this clause from the Constitution hundreds of times in cases about the relationship between the United States and tribes and the powers of tribes, etc. But it's the same idea that Congress has some sort of power over tribes. Now, the Treaty Clause is in Article 6 of the Constitution. I'll let you read that. Or maybe I'll reword it. But this is called the Supremacy Clause and the Treaty Clause. What's the Supremacy Clause? Federal law is supreme in our country over state law. And so this is exactly what it says. This Constitution, Federal Constitution of 1789, the laws of the federal government, and all treaties made or which shall be made, so that's looking to the future, are the supreme law of the land, and no state can ignore them. So this is both the Treaty Clause of the Constitution and the Supremacy Clause. And what does this mean? Why does it say it twice? Well, in the law, we call this a ratification clause. The new Congress, under this 1789 treaty, was ratifying, or this Constitution, was ratifying the previous treaties that the earlier forms of federal government that we had enacted. Well, what treaties are those? Well, I've researched those. By 1789, the United States had signed 8 treaties with Indian nations, one of them being the Shawnee tribe in 1783, and had signed 22 treaties with foreign nations. So our Congress in 1789 was ratifying all treaties the federal government had already made and which shall be made in the future. So those 375 treaties that the United States ultimately entered and ratified with tribal governments are the supreme law of the land. Our treaties are the supreme law of the land. The first Congress immediately enshrined these promises and treaty promises in federal law. This is 1790 law, folks, but it's still the law today. The language has barely changed. You can find this in 25 U.S.C. section 177. No tribe or Indian or nation can sell their land to anyone, a person, persons, or state, unless it's done at a public treaty under the authority of the United States. So the United States took this power, this doctrine of discovery power, and this constitutional power under the Commerce Clause to control all interactions with Indian tribes and all sales of tribal lands, or even individual Indian lands. And this is still the law today. So what is the status of Indian tribes? The United States stopped signing treaties with tribes in 1871 by a statute. This had nothing to do with tribes. This was a fight between the Senate and the House of Representatives over who would control Indian affairs. So it was a political struggle in the Congress. But there is a statute that ended treaty making with tribes. There'll be no more treaties between the United States and tribes unless this act is changed. But the act says very plainly that it does not change any provision of any existing treaty. So our treaties, what we signed, the promises that are still binding on the United States today. What are treaties? Well, the Supreme Court said in 1979 that treaties are contracts between nations. And we read them as we do read contracts. In the same way that we interpret contracts. In 1905, the United States Supreme Court analyzed tribal rights to their lands and came up with this phrase, the reserved rights doctrine. In treaties, the United States rarely gave Indians anything. It was a trade of rights. Treaties were about land sales, trade, war and peace, diplomacy, economic development, all sorts of things. But it was a trade of rights. And so I noticed on my own chart, I got to go home and change it because I used a couple times the word that the United States granted us something. No, wait a minute, that's the word that my students use that in class. I yell at them. The United States didn't give us anything. These treaties were diplomatic, contractual negotiations. And so we were reserving rights for ourselves that we already owned. The United States was not giving us rights. I think it's over. How are treaties interpreted? So let me talk about, and I do not know when I started, so I have an hour more, right? Hey, if you lose track of the time, you start over. I mentioned that treaties are contracts. So how have the federal courts interpreted them? As you well know, tribal governments did not have lawyers with them at these treaty sessions, and 95% of the time the treaty was negotiated in English, maybe with an interpreter that knew how to speak the ultimate languages, and maybe not. So the federal courts have created what are called canons of treaty construction, rules of interpreting treaties. And the three major ones are these. A treaty is to be interpreted as the Indians themselves would have understood the document. What were the natives told by the federal representatives? So that's why you look for treaty minutes of treaty sessions. You want to see what the federal representatives said. What was the promise made? What did interpreters say? What would Indian people on their side, tribal leaders, what would they have understood this English language translated to a couple of different people to mean? We do the same thing with contracts, folks. So this is no great gift to tribal peoples. We interpret treaties like contracts because that's what they were. Second, we interpret treaties in favor of the native peoples. Because the treaty was conducted in English, because the United States usually had a lawyer with them and the tribes didn't, and because it was the United States almost always that was coming to the tribe asking for the treaty. So we interpret the treaties in favor of Indians. And three, if there are any ambiguities in a treaty, anything that's unclear, uncertain, we interpret that against the United States. because the United States broke the treaty. That's contract law. So treaties are contracts, and that is how they get interpreted. Okay, I don't know if I'm at a half hour, but let's look at the chart very briefly. I think I said this already, but I listed the names of the Shawnee and Seneca chiefs that signed our treaties. I wanted you to see that. I wanted you to see these lists. I mean, of course, they're hoping to find who's related to these people, who are they. For me, you'll notice that the title of most of the treaties don't say Shawnee. So we were signing treaties with lots of other tribes. And so I'm looking for the Shawnee and Seneca signers, looking for the mixed bands of Senecas. So if you only have time to read the little bits, of course I've given you a homework assignment. Bowman study, be careful. And I need a 2-page report from all of you.
Well, hello everyone. I've had a very bizarre weekend that I'd like to tell you about. First, it started out, I was invited to a bicentennial in Salem, Indiana. And there I had to compete with an Abraham Lincoln reenactor as I gave a talk about Shawnee history. And obviously the Abraham Lincoln reenactor won. And the crowds there were very minimal. I think I drew a grand total of maybe 15 people there in Salem. And so to come here to Oklahoma and to see such an amazing audience is really the fulfillment of a lifelong dream for me. I can't tell you what an honor it is. It truly is. I mean, if you had told me in 2001 that this would happen someday, I would have said, nah, let's get back to square one. Let's get our feet on the ground, people. And so this is really an amazing thing. And so before I began, George taught me a phrase that I think applies quite nicely to my situation. And let's see. It's "Que te pina cuele mi." And I hope I did it right. George will correct me later, I'm sure. But that means take pity on me. And then with regard to my being here today, speaking before you, there's another great phrase that I actually memorized from many years ago when I spoke with George about some things going on in my life that were kind of strange and bizarre. And it's "Nikani square," which is kind of a way of saying we make plans and God laughs. And for me, being here today is definitely an illustration of Nikani square. So thank you so much for being here. So I wanted to talk today about Captain Lewis, or Colonel Lewis. He was promoted after the War of 1812 to Colonel. That was the name Americans gave him, but his native name was Guadalupe. And as far as I can tell, he's the first recognized chief of the Eastern Shawnee tribe in Lewistown, Ohio. But in order to tell the story of Guadalupe and how he came to be the leader of the Eastern Shawnee tribe, what I wanted to do is put his life history in a much larger context. And what I'm saying here and what I'm arguing is that Guadalupe really fits in a very, very long history of Native leaders who had an imagined dream that was never fulfilled because of the United States government's racism for an Indian state. And so, let's see. So, one of the hallmarks of Shawnee identity for me, just in a general way, is migration. And so, as Chief Wallace mentioned previously, the Shawnees have historic ties to 27 different states in the United States. It's really an amazing geographic range. And it's actually quite old. The first people who were recognized as Shawnee people in the archival record, at least, appeared in the record in 1673 and 1674, respectively. And what's interesting is the 1673 Shawnee person is in Illinois. The 1674 person is in what is now South Carolina. So obviously, these are very different migratory groups of people calling themselves Shawnee. And what happens as a result of that travel and that geographic range is that the Shawnees acquire an incredible linguistic sophistication. And so from very early on, Shawnees are really at the center of big social movements, what historians call revitalization movements, efforts to bring together different members of a variety of tribes, right, in the shared goal of stopping expansion. The Shawnees are always right in the middle of the story. And part of the reason why is because of their migration. And so the first person who was a promoter of this idea of pan-Indian unity was a Shawnee named Peter Chartier. His father was a French trader who had married a Shawnee woman, and Peter Chartier went on to become a trader and also a real advocate for his people. And as you can see from his trajectory in my second book, one of the things I tried to do is to figure out all of the different places that Chartier traveled in order to bring people together to stop, in this case, English expansion into the Ohio Valley region. And what's amazing is that if you look at his map, it pretty nicely parallels Tecumseh's journey through both the Northeast and the Southeast before the War of 1812. And so Tecumseh is really the inheritor of Chartier's movement and migration across the Americas. And as migratory peoples, the Shawnees are very similar to other groups of people from the Great Lakes. And so one of the great things about today is I'm really honored to be speaking before so many different representatives of federally recognized tribes. It's really wonderful and amazing, and it's a real credit to Chief Wallace and to the members of the grant committee. And it's also a distinguishing characteristic of Shawneeness, right, to bring together so many people. And so Chartier's migrations began to get picked up by a Delaware man named Neolin, who was a religious leader, and whose famous ally was an Odawa man named Pontiac. And Neolin had a vision of expelling white people from the Great Lakes region that we now know as Pontiac's War, right? And it's part of this revitalization movement trend that is expressed here by a captive who was part of an unwilling part of this confederacy. So the first or principal doctrine they taught them was to purify themselves from sin, which they thought they could do by the use of emetics and abstinence from carnal knowledge of the different sexes, to quit the use of firearms, and to live entirely in the original state that they were in before the white people found their country. And so these kinds of expressions, of course, become manifest in Shawnee principles taught by Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh much later. But they're adopted here, and what's important about them is that very early on in the Ohio Valley, there were Native people who were thinking of themselves not simply as members of distinct tribes, but rather as a people who shared a common history. A history of oppression at the hands of colonizers who wanted to take their land. And so another characteristic of people from the Ohio Valley region is this thinking of themselves not simply as Shawnee, or not simply as Delaware, not simply as Ottawa, but as part of something larger, right? And so there's this desire to be both a Native person and a Native leader, part of this unified constellation of peoples, as well as a tribal member. Fast forward, and now the social movement that we're talking about is the one shared by the Miami leader, Little Turtle, and the Shawnee leader, Blue Jacket. I would put a picture of Blue Jacket on the slide, but there's no known image of him that is thought to be accurate. So that's why it's missing there. But both Little Turtle and Blue Jacket waged a resistance movement that was specific really to Ohio, and that was also pan-Indian, that also brought together members of many different tribes. And in 1791, Little Turtle and Blue Jacket inflicted the greatest defeat of American forces ever perpetrated by Native Americans. They killed more than 900 soldiers, St. Clair's defeat. But they went on and ultimately lost at what's called the Battle of Falling Timbers. And what's significant, if you look at this map here, is that they were forced to sign what's called the Treaty of Greenville. And Bob figured out this pointer, so let's see if I can do it. See, I can't, because I'm not Bob. Let's do $1.
Second one from the top.
Second one from the top. Oh,
That's a red.
I also dress as a clown and I'm just anyway, right here is the treaty line, and what's significant about this map is that in Peter Chartier's time, the Shawnee villages were right here along this branch of the Scioto River. And if you look at maps of Shawnee history then, what you'll find is that the Shawnees tended to organize themselves according to the division, so the division to which they belonged. And so there was a Kispogo town, and a Picawitha town, and a Chawatha town. And what happens is they faced an invasion of Americans coming from Kentucky. And so what happens is their land is invaded this way. You know, we typically think of it as this way, but it's really not an east to west movement. It's really a south to north movement. And as a result, after 1795, this area of northwest Ohio is the last remaining territory that Shawnees, Delawares, Odawas, and other people in Ohio occupy. And it's this land that is really fought over between 1795 and 1830. What's significant, though, and I brought this quote in to talk about, is Blue Jacket with the 1795 treaty really decides that pan-Indian resistance movements, or creating a united military opposition to American expansion, is a futile cause, that it's simply too destructive. And so Blue Jacket, after 1795, really changes and becomes much more of a promoter or an adherent of peaceful resistance rather than military resistance. And this split within the Shawnee tribe between violent resistance to land hunger or nonviolent resistance has a really important part to play in Quadavithia's ultimate destiny. During that same time, there were Delaware people who were very interested in nonviolent resistance. And so one of the things that I love about what I do as a historian is that I get to really examine the various ways in which Native Americans have really intellectually approached American expansion. You know, the way Native people as true intellectuals, you know, as people carefully considering how they can survive amid colonizers who want to take absolutely everything from them. And so as Blue Jacket and Little Turtle are resisting American expansion militarily, there are Delawares, led by a man named White Eyes, who actually, in one of the first treaties with the United States, the Delawares will tell you the first treaty, Bob will have to clarify it for me, but in this treaty, you know, they basically call for the possibility of creating a native state within the United States, which is really quite remarkable. This is a story that you don't often hear in American history books. A lot of folks really like to emphasize, Tecumseh, and violence, and massacre after massacre. It's the old version of D. Brown's famous book, or infamous book, really, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It's this version of Native American history as only about violence. And there's another story that I think is worth telling, and that Shawnees were very much a part of, and that is, how do we live with Americans and yet retain some of who we are? And so as early as 1778, the Delawares were thinking about this, and they actually were taken seriously by the United States. The possibility of creating a native state was very much an open possibility at that time. My Seneca, Cayuga, or Haudenosaunee friends might disagree with the interpretation of this. Paul nailed me on it a few weeks ago, I think, but we might have to agree to disagree. But with Paul, it's hard because he always kills you with kindness. He's got this great sense of humor. And so feel free to laugh at me. But the Haudenosaunee also had their ideas about the Ohio Valley, and it's a long history. But Joseph Brand thought that perhaps one way to stop American expansion would be to ally with the British and to unite all of the tribes from the Ohio Valley in that united opposition to the British, and to make the Ohio Valley a dish with one spoon, a place from which Native people from all different tribes can unite and create a kind of an Indian homeland. And what's interesting to me about all these social movements is that they're really beginning to talk about Indianness almost in a racial way, as if it's not simply about one's tribal identity. It's really, as a race of people, we've faced this oppressor. We've dealt with their horrible treatment, and we share this common destiny as a people as a result. And so even the Haudenosaunee are in on the game. And so, since we've been through all these social movements so far, by the time we get to the War of 1812, the Shawnees, who were allied with Tenskwatawa and his brother Tecumseh, were really very much in a minority. About 15 years ago, I was asked to do some research on the Shawnee followers of Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh, and I could only locate about 40 people within the Shawnee tribe that followed him. The vast majority of his followers, and these are members of 13 different nations, came from the west and from the north. And so there were people in states such as Michigan and Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri, who came into his alliance. It was quite a vast alliance. There were also Creeks from the southeast who were allied with Tecumseh, and Alabama Coshada people as well. But what Tecumseh is saying here is, that there's this notion of Indianness, right? And that this whole region of the Ohio Valley doesn't belong to any particular tribe, right? But to Indians. And this is really a revolutionary idea, right? That was really counter to the United States. Because what the United States wanted to do was divide and conquer, was to separate people into distinct tribes and then treat with specific chiefs and make land cessions grow out of those specific relationships. And so Tecumseh is really trying to innovate here. But the reason why many Shawnees didn't follow him is because they had already had vast experience with both Blue Jacket and Little Turtles Confederacy, with Peter Chartier's Confederacy, with Neil Lynn and Conyac's Confederacy. And so as a result, most Shawnees, by the time the War of 1812 had come around, were actually either neutral in that war or actually fought with the Americans. And so other Shawnees, about 1,200 people, decided even before the American, or really during the American Revolution, to simply vote with their feet and leave the Ohio Valley. And so a hidden history of Shawnee and Delaware and Peoria and Kickapoo history is that by 1800, a majority of each tribal population was actually west of the Mississippi River. And the reason why they were is nicely and simply stated by this well, at war with the whites. And so early on, there's this recognition, right, that violence is a dead end, literally, and that the best way to deal with the Americans is either to create some kind of pan-Indian resistance movement or really just to leave, right? And so a lot of Native people, specifically Shawnees, migrate and go west of Mississippi. And so here's Quadawipia. And Quadawipia actually became involved in a movement that you would now associate with the Katuas, or the old settlers of the Cherokee Nation, and it existed in both Arkansas and southwestern Missouri, and it was a call for an Indian state. And for Quadawipia, what he argued is that we ought to create an Indian state that has representation proportional to population. And so they actually created a formula where there were about 15 different communities, and their voting rights in the Indian state would be contingent upon population. So obviously the Cherokees had the largest voting bloc. How's that for a continuity? I guess no. But the Kickapoos, Delawares, and Shawnees had lesser votes. But they were all going to create an Indian state that stretched from northwestern Arkansas into southwestern Missouri, and that would become a part of the United States of America. But this Indian state would actually be comfortable with the introduction of Christianity, as well as American forms of agriculture, which basically meant that if you were part of this Indian state, you were to be cool with the idea that men would farm and grow corn, and that women would be domestic help, right, in the American model, right? I mean, that was a big revolution. The thing that really made Americans angry about Shawnees is that women farmed, and men hunted, and that dichotomy in gender just really upset non-Native people. And so William Clark actually, the William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame, actually drew a map of reservations that he hoped to create in this region that would be the basis for the Indian state. And it's here that he wanted this union of tribes and this one great family of Native people to exist. But the tragedy of Quadawipia's story is that as he's calling for an Indian state, if you history buffs are in the room, it also happens to be the exact moment at which Andrew Jackson's form of Indian hating became so popular in the United States. And so obviously Andrew Jackson was an early proponent of Manifest Destiny that Bob mentioned earlier, and an advocate for the Indian Removal Act. And so what ended up happening is non-Native Christian missionaries reflected on the ideas of an Indian state promoted by Quadawipia and Cherokee people like him, and then said, I have an idea. Let's make an Indian state, but we'll call it Indian Territory. And so for Isaac McCoy, what that meant And he literally gave it a name, and thankfully it wasn't called this, but he wanted it to be called Aboriginea, which is not easy to say. In fact, I have a tougher time saying Aboriginea than I do speaking Shawnee, George, so there you go. Anywho, Isaac McCoy and his vision of an Indian state became, in a sense, federal law. And what happened in Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma is that the Jacksonians created essentially an area that was reserved exclusively for members of federally recognized tribes, and that were supposed to, in which they were supposed to be really quarantined from non-native people. So you had to have legal permission to enter into Indian territory. The only people who could legitimately be there were, yeah, you guessed it, missionaries and government agents. And so one of the things that I'm really excited for about this grant is I am not a Shawnee tribal member. I'm simply a historian trying to make his way in the world who's been picked up off the street by some Shawnees a while back. That's all I am. In fact, the first time I met George, through his brother, all I heard of him is, "Oh yeah, hold that white guy there. I want to talk to him." And so I've always been known as that white guy, and that's fine with me. So anywho, but what's really exciting about this grant, what's so important about it, is that it covers this period from 1830 to 1945. And really, from my perspective, there's not that much that's known about Native American history in this time period. It is literally a void in our knowledge. And so if we ask, Glenn and I were speaking, sorry, no disrespect, Chief and I were speaking last night, and she said, we need to know who our leaders were between 1830 and 1867. I mean, this is a federally recognized nation. This is a Native nation. We need to know who our leaders are, right? And so through this research, we're going to be finding that knowledge. And my hope is that what it'll do is it'll rehabilitate or restore our memory of forgotten leaders such as the men pictured here. Because we focus too much attention, it seems to me, on the bullet-by-bullet history of Native American history. There's too much attention focused on people like Tecumseh, frankly, who died on the battlefield, and not enough on the people who tried to make a way of life that was sustainable for people after the last bullets were shot. And so in Eastern Shawnee history, I think we'll find great examples of Native American intellectuals, such as Quawikia, people who figured out really how to live behind the frontier amid non-native people in a sustainable way. And so that's the hope for this project, and that's my reason for being part of it. Is I really am committed to this idea that we need to learn more about leaders such as Quawikia peoples as well. So thank you for listening to me. Yahweh.